Maria James had never expected to find herself in a small-town courtroom. She was used to high-powered meetings, global trade negotiations, and policy-making that shaped the future of industries. As a federal advisor on trade equity, Maria's job involved working with leaders from around the world, crafting policies that ensured fair practices in international commerce. Today, however, she was in a much smaller arena, a dusty courtroom in a town far from the corridors of power. She stood tall, her calm demeanor in sharp contrast to the tension that filled the room. Maria had been summoned to court because of a minor infraction related to a local ordinance, a technicality, really, that had come up in a contract she had signed with a local supplier. It was a simple matter that she thought would be cleared up with a few clarifications, but from the moment she walked in, she could sense the undercurrent of judgment. The courtroom was filled with the usual local figures: the sheriff, a couple of lawyers, and other townspeople who were there for their own small cases. None of them knew who Maria was. Judge Leonard Hayes, an older white man in his late 50s, glanced up from his papers as she was called. His eyes briefly flickered with surprise, though he quickly masked it behind a stern expression. Maria had expected to be treated as just another case, but the slight pause in the judge's reaction caught her attention. She wondered if he recognized something in her, perhaps her attire, or the way she carried herself. She wasn't just any ordinary person standing in front of him. "Ms. James, I see you've been cited for violating a local business ordinance. How do you plead?" Judge Hayes asked, his voice firm and unwavering. Maria stood tall, her voice composed as she responded, "Your Honor, I don't intend to dismiss the citation, but I believe this was a misunderstanding. The nature of my work often requires flexibility, especially when dealing with contracts that span multiple jurisdictions. I can provide documentation that explains this." The judge didn't seem to hear her explanation. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the paperwork, then looked back at her. "You're claiming that your position in business requires you to sidestep local regulations. That's quite a convenient excuse, isn't it?" His tone was dismissive, tinged with skepticism. "I understand you're an advisor, Ms. James, but the law is the law. Ignorance or oversight won't excuse you here." Maria tried to stay composed. She had dealt with skepticism before, but never quite like this. "I'm not claiming ignorance, Your Honor. I'm explaining that my work often involves complicated cross-border agreements, and the nuances sometimes overlap with local rules." Judge Hayes cut her off. "If we all decided which rules we want to follow based on our personal agendas, this place would descend into chaos. I'm imposing a fine of $1,000. You can pay it at the clerk's office after the hearing." Maria's heart sank. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the sudden, sweeping dismissal of her explanation. As she left the courtroom, she could already feel the sting of judgment. The judge had seen her not as an expert or professional, but as someone who was simply out to avoid accountability. She had hoped for a fair hearing, but in the end, she walked out with a feeling of injustice gnawing at her. Maria sat in her car outside the courthouse, the engine idling but her mind racing. She had been through countless high-stakes negotiations and tense policy discussions, yet this moment felt different. The fine was insignificant compared to the work she did every day, but the way she had been treated, dismissed so easily, gnawed at her. It was more than just an inconvenience. It was a reminder that assumptions often shaped people's actions, even in places where justice was supposed to be blind. Maria was not one to dwell on negativity. She took a deep breath and pulled herself together. She was a professional, and this was nothing more than a bump in the road. The fine itself wasn't what bothered her. It was the sheer lack of understanding about her role and the dismissive tone of the judge. His attitude had suggested that her work, her expertise, and even her very presence in that room were secondary to his view of her as just another person trying to wriggle out of responsibility. She put the car in drive and headed back to her office. The familiar hum of the vehicle was oddly soothing, but the sense of injustice lingered. She wasn't sure if she'd ever cross paths with Judge Hayes again, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that her work, critical to the fair distribution of resources, labor, and trade, had never been more important. If people like her weren't in those rooms making decisions, who would ensure that equity prevailed? As Maria entered the sleek, glass-fronted building that housed her office, she was greeted by her colleagues. A couple of them raised their eyebrows, sensing something was off. Maria, however, offered only a tight smile and quickly got back to her work. She was in the middle of reviewing the details of a major trade agreement with several foreign governments. There were complex negotiations ahead: trade tariffs, labor standards, and regulations on sustainable supply chains. This was the stuff that shaped the global economy. No time for distractions. Her assistant, a young man named Jason, handed her a stack of reports. He noticed the look on her face but said nothing. Maria was known for her poise, and the weight of the situation wasn't something she usually carried visibly. But today was different. By the time her team gathered for the afternoon briefing, Maria had already buried the court incident deep in her thoughts. It wasn't a problem she was going to let define her. She had been in rooms where world leaders had listened when she spoke. She had been at the table with some of the brightest minds in trade, policy, and economics. She had earned her seat in those spaces, and no fine, no judge, could take that away from her. Still, as the meeting went on, Maria's mind kept returning to the courtroom. She knew she would have to deal with the fine, but more importantly, she was determined that her voice would not be silenced by assumptions. She was ready for whatever came next. Maria had thought that the fine would be a minor blip in her otherwise busy schedule, but in the days that followed, the incident began to take on a life of its own. The small-town courtroom, once a place for local disputes, had inadvertently set the stage for something bigger. Maria was no longer just a federal advisor on trade equity. She was now the subject of local media attention. What had been a routine citation had quickly turned into a story that everyone seemed to want to talk about. It started with a brief mention in the local newspaper. The headline read, "Federal Advisor Fined by Local Court for Ordinance Violation." The article was short and mostly factual, listing the fine and providing a brief quote from Judge Hayes about the decision. But the following day, the tone changed. The story had gone viral. Local residents, who had never heard of Maria before, began to search her name online. A reporter, intrigued by the mention of her role in the federal government, dug deeper into her background. Within hours, Maria's name was everywhere, across news sites, social media platforms, and local forums. The story was no longer just about the fine. It was about who Maria James really was. The media quickly discovered that she wasn't just another businessperson trying to avoid a penalty. She was a key player in shaping the way international trade was conducted, a highly respected federal advisor responsible for negotiating policies that ensured fair economic practices worldwide. The contrast between the woman described in the articles and the one Judge Hayes had seen in his courtroom was stark. The headlines now painted her as a leader in trade equity, someone who had spent years working on global agreements to reduce inequality in trade. As one article put it, Maria James, the federal advisor who helps balance the global economic scales. The shift was swift. People who had been quick to criticize Maria now found themselves in awe. Social media erupted with posts supporting her, with users sharing the news of her fine alongside praise for her work. Maria's story was no longer a simple courtroom incident. It became a conversation about fairness, respect, and the assumptions people made when they didn't understand the bigger picture. For Maria, the attention was overwhelming but not unwelcome. She had always known that the work she did mattered, but seeing it being recognized in such an unexpected way was a reminder that change often came from the most unlikely sources. Still, she remained focused on the task at hand. The fine was a nuisance, but it wasn't her defining moment. What truly mattered was the work she continued to do, advocating for fair trade practices and using her voice to push for equality in the global economy. As the media coverage grew, Maria's colleagues began to check in on her. They were shocked by how the incident had snowballed. Jason, her assistant, mentioned he had seen posts on social media calling for the judge to apologize, with some even suggesting that his actions were a public mistake. Maria simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She hadn't expected any of this, but in a way, it was exactly the kind of attention her work needed. And the world was now paying attention. Judge Leonard Hayes sat at his desk, the weight of his decision pressing down on him more heavily with each passing day. His role as a judge in the small town had always been straightforward. Cases were simple, people followed the rules, and his judgments were rarely questioned. He had prided himself on being firm but fair, sticking strictly to the law without allowing personal biases to interfere. But lately, something had been bothering him. It started with Maria's case, and now, with the local news exploding with her name, it was impossible to ignore. He had expected the fine to be just another routine case, a local woman appearing before him, claiming that her work had created a technical issue with a local ordinance. He had dismissed her explanation as an excuse. After all, he'd seen it many times before, people trying to skirt the law by using their jobs or circumstances as a shield. But as he sat at his desk, reading through the news articles about Maria's work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. The first article had come in early that morning, a piece from the town's biggest newspaper detailing Maria's impressive career as a federal advisor on trade equity. The more Hayes read, the more he realized just how much he didn't know. Maria was no ordinary citizen. Her name appeared in major trade publications, her policies discussed in boardrooms that stretched from Washington, D.C. to Brussels. She wasn't just any advisor. She was someone who helped shape global economic systems. She had worked to ensure fairness in trade deals, advocating for marginalized communities and negotiating with foreign governments to create policies that promoted equality. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages, coming across a feature that highlighted her critical role in international trade agreements. He had no idea. He had made his ruling based on his own assumptions, treating her like any other person in his courtroom, without understanding the breadth of her influence. That afternoon, Judge Hayes received a call from a colleague, a lawyer who had followed the case with curiosity. "Leonard, you won't believe what I've just learned about that woman you find. She's not just some businesswoman. She's a key figure in federal policy. Her work with global trade has had a massive impact." His colleague's words echoed in his mind as he sat back in his chair, a feeling of unease settling in his chest. How could he have been so quick to judge? He had based his decision on limited information, assuming that Maria was just another person trying to get away with something. He had let his own perceptions cloud his judgment. The realization stung. He hadn't given her the respect she deserved, not just because of her position, but because of her contributions to something much larger than himself or his courtroom. Judge Hayes thought about what he could have done differently. How often had he let his own biases influence his decisions without even realizing it? He had treated Maria as if she were just another faceless individual, not stopping to consider the full picture. It was a lesson he hadn't wanted to learn, but had no choice but to confront now. As the days passed, Hayes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to make things right. The story of Maria James and the fine had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a small, seemingly insignificant court case in a sleepy town had become a topic of national discussion. News outlets across the country picked up the story, some sharing it in disbelief and others in shock. Social media platforms were flooded with posts, many of them questioning the fairness of Judge Hayes' decision. Comment threads turned into debates over the assumptions that had led to the fine. Was it fair for someone of Maria's stature to be treated like an ordinary citizen with no special consideration? Maria's role as a federal advisor had been at the heart of the conversation. Her professional accomplishments, her negotiation of trade agreements that promoted fairness and equality in global markets, were now being widely recognized. Headlines that once mentioned her in passing now showcased her as a key player in the economic landscape, a woman who helped level the playing field in international trade. Maria James, the woman who fights for fairness in global trade. Read one prominent headline. But with the praise came a backlash too. There were some who felt that Maria, despite her important work, should not be treated any differently from others when it came to the law. No one is above the law, they argued. She should have followed the rules just like anyone else. But these voices were quickly overshadowed by others, who pointed out the irony of how a figure working for justice and equity in global trade could be dismissed so carelessly by the very system that was meant to uphold fairness. On local forums, the townspeople expressed their own thoughts. Some defended the judge, saying that the law must apply equally to everyone, no matter their background or profession. But many others felt that Maria had been unfairly treated, and they began to demand accountability. Posts went viral, calling for Judge Hayes to issue an apology. "The judge should have known who she was," one post read. "She's worked for years making sure trade deals benefit everyone, and he didn't even take a moment to learn her name." In a surprising twist, some began to discuss the broader issue of how people in positions of power, especially women and people of color, are often overlooked or dismissed, even when they are at the top of their fields. The conversation soon expanded beyond Maria's case to include stories of other professionals who had faced similar treatment. The public discourse shifted, with many demanding a revaluation of how people in authority, like judges, interact with those who come before them, especially when they come from backgrounds that might not immediately match the standard expectations. Maria, for her part, remained calm amidst the storm of public commentary. She knew her work spoke for itself, and she didn't need anyone's validation. But she did recognize the importance of the conversation that had been sparked. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about the assumptions people made and the biases they carried, whether they were conscious or not. And while the attention was overwhelming, Maria saw it as an opportunity to keep pushing for fairness, not only in global trade but in every aspect of life. Her colleagues, too, began to take notice of the ripple effect. Jason, her assistant, mentioned to her that the incident had sparked conversations in government circles, with some wondering whether the judge's actions were indicative of larger systemic issues in how people in power treat those they perceive as other. Even the people who had been closest to her, those who had worked alongside her for years, seemed more aware of the challenges she faced in spaces that didn't always understand her. Judge Leonard Hayes sat at his desk, the weight of his earlier decision pressing on him like never before. The more he thought about Maria James, the more he realized the extent of his misjudgment. It wasn't just that he had fined a woman who had done nothing wrong. It was that he had failed to see the bigger picture. In his career, he had always prided himself on being impartial, treating every case with the same respect and diligence. But Maria's case had exposed a blind spot, a gap in his ability to truly understand the people who came before him. It wasn't just that she was a federal advisor. It was that her work, her dedication to creating fairer trade systems, impacted millions of lives. It seemed impossible that someone like her, who worked tirelessly to promote equity and justice on a global scale, could be dismissed so easily in his courtroom. He hadn't taken the time to understand who she was or why her explanation mattered. As news about the fine continued to spread, the public reaction only deepened his discomfort. People weren't just questioning the fine, they were questioning his professionalism. In the local town hall, whispers began circulating about the judge's decision. Some residents, typically staunch defenders of local authority, were now asking how a figure like Maria could have been treated with such disregard. The more Leonard thought about it, the more he realized how important it was to make things right. Late one evening, after hours of deliberating, he decided to call Maria. He wasn't sure how she would respond, but he knew it was the only way to move forward. Picking up the phone, his hand trembled slightly as he dialed her number. He had already drafted an apology in his mind, but he knew the words would mean little without genuine remorse behind them. When Maria picked up the phone, her voice was calm, almost welcoming. "Hello, Judge Hayes," she said, with no trace of anger or bitterness. "Ms. James, this is Judge Hayes," he began, his voice steady but earnest. I wanted to personally apologize for the way your case was handled. I made a judgment without fully understanding who you were and the work that you do. I've come to realize that I acted too quickly, and I've been reflecting on the mistake I made. I hope you'll accept my apology." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Leonard braced himself for her response, unsure of what to expect. But then Maria spoke, her tone measured but kind. "Judge Hayes, I appreciate your call. I'm not angry about the fine itself. I understand that mistakes happen. What I really appreciate is that you're taking the time to reconsider how you approach these situations. That kind of self-reflection is important, and it's something we can all learn from." Her words were not filled with anger, but a quiet grace that left Leonard feeling humbled. He knew he had a lot to learn, not just about the law, but about the people it was meant to serve. Maria's ability to respond with such understanding, despite the misjudgment she had faced, left him in awe. "Thank you, Ms. James. I'll do better," he said, a sense of relief washing over him. "If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." "I'll be in touch," she replied, the conversation ending on a note of mutual respect. As Leonard hung up the phone, he felt a shift inside him. It wasn't just about making amends for one case. It was about becoming a better judge, a more thoughtful person, and learning how to approach each situation with more humility and understanding. He knew the road ahead would require more than just a change of heart. It would require a change of perspective. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was on the right path. The apology from Judge Hayes had caught Maria off guard, but she was pleasantly surprised by its sincerity. It wasn't often that people in positions of power acknowledged their mistakes so directly, especially not to someone like her, an advisor working in a world where decisions were often made in backrooms and boardrooms far from the eyes of the public. But this call was different. It wasn't just a matter of clearing up a small misunderstanding. It was about someone reevaluating their stance and showing the humility to make amends. Maria appreciated the gesture, even if it didn't erase the frustration she had felt in that courtroom. In the days that followed, Maria's life gradually returned to its usual rhythm. She continued her work with the federal government, pushing forward with trade policies that ensured fairness and equity in international deals. However, the ripple effect from the incident continued to reverberate through the small town. People were still talking about it, still grappling with the larger questions it had raised. Judge Hayes, for his part, seemed to take the lessons he'd learned to heart. He began to speak publicly about the importance of understanding the diverse backgrounds of the individuals who appeared before him. He made it clear that he had learned from his mistake, and he even promised to review the way local ordinances were applied to people in positions of influence. It wasn't just a one-off apology. It became part of a broader conversation about fairness, bias, and the importance of treating every case with the respect it deserved. The town itself had started to shift in its thinking, too. Some locals who had initially criticized Maria's presence in the courtroom began to come forward, acknowledging that perhaps the judge had been too quick to make assumptions. Conversations at local diners and coffee shops turned from judgment to reflection, with people questioning how often they too had made snap judgments based on incomplete information. A few began to take a greater interest in global trade and the work Maria did, with some even attending her public speeches and policy discussions, eager to learn more. For Maria, the impact of the case had been unexpected, but not unwelcome. The media had brought attention to her work in a way that she had never anticipated, and the public conversation that had followed gave her a platform to advocate for the very principles of fairness and equity that had been at the core of her career. While she never sought out fame, she realized that sometimes, in order to make real change, visibility was essential. The fine, in the end, had been a turning point, not just for Maria, but for the judge, the town, and even herself. As Maria continued to speak out in favor of trade equity and human rights, she began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for fairness in policy. Now she was part of a much larger movement, one that was challenging assumptions, correcting past wrongs, and calling for a more just society, one small step at a time. And she knew that this was only the beginning. Months passed since the incident with Judge Hayes, and life seemed to settle back into its regular rhythm for Maria. The media coverage had tapered off, but the ripple effect of that small courtroom clash remained. The conversation about bias, fairness, and assumptions had taken root, both in the town and beyond. People, from local citizens to colleagues in the federal government, began to see Maria's work and the larger issues surrounding it in a new light. She had always known that change didn't happen overnight, but this was different. The conversations were deeper, more thoughtful, and increasingly focused on the broader issues of equity that were at the heart of her work. Judge Hayes, too, seemed to be on a different path. His public acknowledgement of his mistake and his commitment to better understanding those who appeared before him had garnered praise. The local community watched as he worked to create a more inclusive and mindful approach to his role. He had become more engaged in educating others about the complexities of the world outside his courtroom. Town meetings became a space for open discussions about fairness, accountability, and how local policies might unintentionally perpetuate bias. Maria didn't seek out these changes. She wasn't in it for recognition or validation. But the incident had forced everyone to confront something they had often overlooked: the power of assumptions, the impact of inequality, and the necessity of empathy in every aspect of life. As the story of her fine and its aftermath became a case study in fairness, Maria found herself invited to speak at more forums and policy discussions. What had once been a small, isolated event was now part of a much larger dialogue on justice. One day, while speaking at a major trade policy summit in Washington, D.C., Maria was asked about her thoughts on the judge's apology and how it had affected her. She paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had transpired. "I don't think the apology changed much for me," she said with a quiet smile. "What mattered was that a system that often operates without questioning its own biases started asking the right questions. That's the work I've been doing for years. Asking those questions and challenging the systems that perpetuate inequality. But the most important thing, I think, is that we all have a responsibility to listen and learn." Her words resonated with the audience, and the conversation shifted from Maria's personal story to the much larger need for systemic change. By sharing her experience, she had given people permission to examine their own assumptions and biases. The impact of that small courtroom moment, the fine, the public backlash, the apology, had sparked a movement toward understanding. As Maria left the summit, her thoughts wandered to Judge Hayes. She hoped he had continued his journey of self-reflection. She hoped that, in some small way, her experience with him would become a reminder to not just judge what's visible, but to look deeper, beyond what's on the surface. Maria knew that her fight for fairness was far from over. There would always be more work to do, more systems to challenge, more injustices to correct. But she also knew that, sometimes, even the most unexpected encounters could create lasting change. And that was enough to keep her going.